Have you ever felt, even surrounded by people, that there is a silent void that no one can fill, as if something essential is missing, but you can't explain exactly what it is? It's that moment when the house is quiet, the clock seems higher than it should, and thoughts start to spin non-stop, bringing memories, doubts, and a type of restlessness that doesn't go away with distractions. You try to ignore it, you try to occupy your mind, but deep down you know that there is something deeper asking for attention, something that cannot be solved with common answers. And the more you try to understand, the more it seems that this feeling hides, as if it is always one step ahead of your consciousness. Now imagine that this emptiness is not absence, but a sign, a silent call, something that has always been present, but for some reason has been forgotten, ignored, or simply not noticed. There is a truth hidden in Scripture, something that many have read but few have actually seen, a spiritual key that is not locked, but still remains inaccessible to those who do not know how to look. It is not complicated, it does not require advanced knowledge, but it does require sensitivity. And that's exactly what changes everything. Because what if this discomfort you feel is not the end, but the beginning of something much bigger? What if there is a real, constant presence that has never moved away, even in the moments when you thought you were completely alone? The Bible reveals, in Isaiah 41:10, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I strengthen you and help you and uphold you with my faithful right hand." But there's something within that promise that most have never really accessed. There is a hidden path within this statement, a kind of understanding that transforms not only what you feel, but how you live each day. And today, along this journey, something will be revealed in a clear, direct, almost impossible to ignore way. It's not theory. It's not just a pretty word. It's a living secret. And if you stay until the end, there is a great chance that even today, something inside you will begin to change in a quiet but profoundly real way. At this moment, you will begin to perceive something different, because everything that will be revealed here goes beyond simple words. It is profound teachings that show how God acts even when everything seems confusing and silent. Throughout this journey, you will understand how to recognize God's presence in the most invisible details of your life, how to find direction in the midst of doubts, and how to feel peace even in difficult times. Each story, each passage was chosen to strengthen your faith, renew your hope, and show that nothing you experience is by chance. And as you keep watching, you can feel as if this message is speaking directly to you, as if each word is a response to something you haven't even been able to express yet. Maybe it's no coincidence that you're here now. And if this message has already started to touch your heart, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this can bring this same light to other people who also need to find this way. And it is exactly at this point in the journey that something begins to make sense in a different way, because what seems empty can actually be the perfect setting for a meeting that changes everything. The desert, in spiritual language, has never been just a place of loss or silence, but a space where distractions disappear and truth becomes impossible to ignore. Moses did not get there by spiritual choice. He arrived fleeing, carrying fear, guilt, and uncertainty, trying to rebuild his own life away from everything he knew. And maybe this sounds familiar, because often life also leads to places that weren't planned, times when everything seems out of control and without clear direction. It was exactly in this unlikely scenario that something unexpected happened. In Exodus 3:2 it is written, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush." But the detail that few realize is that the fire was there, visible, and yet it needed to be noticed. Moses could have gone on his way, ignored that moment, and nothing would have changed. This reveals a profound principle. God's presence is often before our eyes, but it is only perceived by those who decide to stop, observe, and draw near. The desert did not create the meeting, it revealed what was already prepared. And this is where something starts to fall into place, because there are times when silence is not abandonment, but preparation. When the noise subsides, when the external responses disappear, something begins to move inside. It is in this space that the voice of God finds space to be truly heard, without interference, without distractions, without haste. And then comes something even deeper. God doesn't just appear, He calls by name. He doesn't speak to crowds at that moment. He speaks directly to someone who was feeling lost. This completely changes the way of understanding the divine presence, because it reveals that God does not work only with major events, but with personal, intimate, specific encounters. He does not depend on the ideal scenario. He transforms any scenario into a meeting point. Perhaps what today seems like a period of confusion, loneliness, or even estrangement is exactly the place where something greater is about to happen. Because when God decides to reveal Himself, it doesn't matter where a person is, it only matters if he is willing to notice. And this perception does not come from the outside. It begins from within, in a simple, almost imperceptible, but profoundly real moment. If this message has somehow found a place within you, even if you still can't explain it, maybe it's no accident. Perhaps there is something being awakened right now. And if that makes sense in your heart, write down here, Amen, not as a habit, but as a heartfelt response to something you felt while listening. And there is an even more delicate moment in this spiritual journey, because the biggest challenge is not always outside. It often happens inside the mind itself, in the racing heart, in the thoughts that do not stop, in the fatigue that is not physical, but emotional. Elijah knew the power of God. He had seen extraordinary miracles. He had faced prophets. He had experienced victories that few have experienced. But even so, at a certain moment, he finds himself seized by fear, exhaustion, and a deep desire to run away from everything. This reveals something that many people don't admit. It's possible to be close to God and still feel overwhelmed inside. Elijah runs to Mount Horeb, perhaps expecting to meet God in the same way as before, in grandiose manifestations, in visible signs, in something that could immediately take away that weight he carried. And then something starts to happen. A strong wind passes by, then an earthquake, then fire. Everything that could be interpreted as the presence of God. But the text makes it clear that God was not in any of these signs. Until in 1 Kings 19:12, something completely unexpected appears. And after the fire, a still small voice. This completely changes the way we understand how God communicates. Because while many are expecting something extraordinary on the outside, God often chooses to speak in the quietest place there is, inside. And that's exactly why so many people can't hear. It's not because God isn't speaking, it's because the internal noise is too loud. There are worries, fears, memories, anxiety, all competing for attention at the same time. The presence of God does not need to compete for space with chaos. It reveals itself when the heart begins to slow down, when the soul allows a moment of stillness. And here is a profound point. Learning to listen to God is not developing a rare gift. It is developing sensitivity. It is to realize that not every answer comes with noise, nor does every direction come with visible signs. Sometimes it is a soft impression, a quiet conviction, a peace that makes no sense but remains. Elijah didn't just get a word, he got direction, restoration, and purpose in that quiet moment. This shows that the transformation does not happen in the impact of the noise, but in the depth of listening. And perhaps what you need most today is not more external responses, but a real moment of inner silence where that voice can finally be heard. If this word is awakening within you a sincere desire to hear God more clearly, perhaps this is the time to respond simply but truly. Write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." And if this message is touching you, also leave your like, because this helps other people learn to recognize that same voice that can transform everything. And it is at this point that the journey deepens even further, because after learning to perceive the voice of God in the silence, an inevitable question arises. What sustains someone when everything around them goes dark? Because there are times when it's not just confusion or tiredness, it's real fear, it's pressure, it's the feeling of being surrounded by situations that seem greater than one's strength. David knew this place well. He did not write beautiful words in times of comfort. He declared truths while being persecuted, betrayed, and constantly threatened. Still, in the midst of this scenario, he releases a phrase that crosses time with impressive force. In Psalm 23:4, he says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." There is something very profound in this statement that often goes unnoticed. David does not say that the valley is gone. He does not say that the pain is over. He does not say that the enemies are gone. The valley is still there. The darkness continues to exist. But fear loses its strength, and that changes everything, because the problem has never been just what's around, but how it's tackled from within. When someone goes through difficult times without the awareness of God's presence, everything becomes heavier, more frightening, more uncertain. But when this awareness becomes real, something begins to change internally. The situation may even be the same, but the way of walking within it is completely different. The expression, "You are with me," is not just a catchphrase, it is a revelation of spiritual positioning. David is not talking about a distant God. He is talking about a close, constant, active presence in the middle of the valley. This means that the darkest place is not a sign of abandonment, but it may be exactly the place where this presence becomes most evident. And perhaps here is something that many need to understand. The presence of God does not prevent the walk through the valley, but guarantees that the valley will not have the final word. There is a limit that darkness cannot cross when God is present. There is a security that does not depend on external circumstances, but on the internal certainty that you are not alone. And when that truth begins to make sense within you, fear begins to lose ground, anxiety subsides, and a quiet force begins to emerge, not based on what you see, but on who is with you. Because in the end, it's not about avoiding valleys, it's about crossing them in a different way. If this truth has touched you in any way, even in a simple way, maybe it's time to express it. Write in the comments, "God is with me." Sometimes a short statement like this not only reveals faith, but it strengthens something within you that needed to be remembered. And when this awareness begins to grow within the heart, something even deeper needs to be understood. Because it is not just a matter of isolated moments in which God manifests himself, but of a presence that can be constant, continuous, alive in every moment of life. And no one revealed this as clearly as Jesus himself. He not only taught about God, he lived in such an intense connection that his words did not come from theory, but from direct experience. In John 8:29, he declares something that completely changes the way we see this relationship. "He who sent me is with me. It didn't leave me alone." This statement carries a level of depth that many have not yet accessed. Jesus was not saying that God appeared at specific times, but that his presence was permanent. In every decision, in every word, in every silence, there was a continual awareness that he was not alone. And this raises an important question. What made this connection so constant? The answer lies not in something complicated, but in something that requires surrender. Jesus lived totally in line with the Father's will. He himself states that he did only what pleased God, And it is exactly in this alignment that the presence ceases to be occasional and becomes constant. This completely changes the way we live. Because many people seek to feel God only at specific moments, in special situations, in prepared environments. But Jesus shows that it is possible to live every day with this active awareness. It's not about feeling something all the time, but about knowing, with conviction, that He is present in every moment, even when there are no visible signs. And here is a point that transforms everything. God's presence does not go away, but it can fail to be perceived when life is out of line with what He wants, not as a punishment, but as a consequence of an internal disconnection. The closer one comes to God's will, the more sensitive one becomes to His presence. And this does not require perfection, it requires intention, decision, a heart willing to walk in the right direction, even with limitations. Jesus did not live a life far from human reality. He faced challenges, pressures, pains, but at no time did He lose this awareness. And that reveals that this experience is not out of reach. It is available. The difference is in how each person chooses to live, in how they decide to align their thoughts, their attitudes, and their direction with what God establishes. And maybe at this moment, something begins to make sense in a new way within you. Not as a distant idea, but as a real possibility to live with this constant presence, not only at specific times, but every day. If you're here so far, it's because God is speaking to you in some way. There is something being awakened, something being aligned within your heart. And at the end of this journey, there will be a special moment, a deep prayer, prepared to strengthen your faith and renew your connection with God. So keep going, because what is yet to be revealed can completely transform the way you perceive His presence in your life. And then a revelation arises that completely breaks human logic, because so far it seems that everything requires strength, control, constant firmness, but God presents a path that goes in the opposite direction. Paulo, an extremely prepared, experienced man, someone who had already faced numerous challenges, reaches a point where he recognizes something that many avoid admitting. He had limitations. There was a weakness that accompanied him, something he wanted to see resolved, removed, overcome. And instead of receiving the answer he expected, he receives something much deeper. In 2 Corinthians 12:9 it is written, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This answer completely changes the understanding of what it means to be spiritually strong, because contrary to what many people think, God is not looking for perfect people, secure all the time, who never fail or never feel weak. It manifests itself precisely where there is space, where there is truth, where there is surrender. And here's a point that transforms everything. Weakness, when recognized, ceases to be a problem and becomes a point of connection. Because while someone tries to sustain everything on his own, trying to maintain absolute control, trying to hide his limitations, the presence of God meets resistance. But when this control is loosened, when there is a sincere recognition that you cannot do everything alone, something begins to happen. Paul could have insisted, he could have been frustrated, he could have interpreted it as abandonment, but he chooses to understand what was behind that answer. He realizes that God's grace is not just a support, but an active force that comes into play just where human capacity reaches its limit. This means that what you consider weakness may be the very place where God wants to manifest Himself most strongly. And perhaps this goes against everything that has been learned throughout life, because the tendency is to hide weaknesses, avoid showing vulnerability, try to solve everything with one's own effort. But spiritually, the path is different. God's presence does not move away from weakness. It draws near. Not to keep the person in the same place, but to transform that point into a channel of power. This does not mean accepting a limited life, but understanding that true strength is not born from isolated effort, but from dependence. There is a force that cannot be explained, a support that does not come from within, but from a presence that begins to act when someone decides to truly trust. And when that happens, something changes quietly but profoundly. If this truth spoke to you in any way, perhaps it is time to turn it into a simple but meaningful attitude. Declare in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Write it as an act of delivery. And if this message is making sense to you, leave your like, because this can bring that same peace to other people who also need to find this way. And it is at this point that the revelation becomes even more intense, because we are no longer just talking about silence, weakness, or direction, but about moments when the pressure is so strong that it seems impossible to stand up. Situations where faith is tested in a real way, where there is no middle ground, where giving in seems easier than standing firm. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were placed in just such a scenario. Faced with a direct order, they had two options: deny what they believed in, or face the consequences. And the consequence was not symbolic, it was a fiery furnace, prepared to completely destroy any chance of survival. But something inside them was stronger than fear. They did not know what would happen. They had no guarantee of immediate deliverance, but they had enough conviction to stand firm. And when they are thrown into the fire, what happens breaks all human expectation. In Daniel 3:25, the king himself declares in surprise, "I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and the appearance of the fourth is like the Son of God." This detail changes everything, because the miracle does not begin when they leave the furnace, it begins within it. God's presence did not stay outside, waiting for the right moment to act. It entered the fire along with them. This reveals one of the most profound teachings about "I am with you." It does not mean the absence of proof, but company within it. And perhaps here is something that many need to understand today. There are times when the question is not, "Why is this happening?" but "Who is with me in this?" Because when God's presence becomes real, even the most hostile environment loses its destructive power. The fire continues to burn, but it does not consume. The situation remains difficult, but it does not define the ending. And there is something even deeper in this episode. They weren't trapped inside the fire, they were walking. What should paralyze, limit, and destroy becomes a space of freedom. This shows that when God is present, even what seemed like the end can become a place of manifestation of His power. The deliverance in this case was not just leaving without getting burned. It was to prove that God's presence is sufficient to sustain someone, even in the worst-case scenario. And when they finally come out, there's no smell of smoke, there's no sign of damage, as if fire had never had authority over them. Maybe what you're facing today seems too intense, too hard, too heavy. But this story reveals something that needs to be guarded. God does not watch from afar. He enters into the process, and when He comes in, everything changes, even if outwardly it looks the same for a while. If this message has already started to touch something inside you, maybe it's no coincidence. Perhaps it is a sign that God is speaking directly to your heart, and you can be a part of it in a simple but powerful way. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This message reaches other people who are also going through their own furnaces. Do it now and help spread that faith that sustains even in the most difficult times. And after understanding that God is present even in the fire, one of the deepest questions of the human soul arises, something that many people carry in silence. What happens when it is not the world that hurts us, but our own choices? When did the error not come from outside, but from within? Peter knew this weight. He wasn't just someone who failed, he was someone who promised faithfulness and, in the face of pressure, denied Jesus 3 times. It was not a small mistake, it was something that broke his own image, his confidence, his identity. And maybe this touches on something very personal, because there are times when the greatest difficulty is not facing external circumstances, but dealing with what was left inside after a failure, the shame, the guilt, the thought that it could have been different. Pedro carried all this. And the most impressive thing is that after all, Jesus does not ignore him, does not push him away, does not replace him. In John 21:17, Jesus asks a simple but meaningful question: do you love me? He doesn't start by pointing out the mistake. He doesn't start by remembering the failure. It starts with relationship, because God's presence is not manifested to condemn, but to restore. And this question is not asked once, it is repeated, as if it were reconstructing layer by layer what had been broken within Peter. This reveals something powerful. Failure does not cancel the call. The mistake does not define the end of the story. That which seemed lost can be restored when there is a true encounter with the presence of God. Jesus not only forgives Peter, he gives him back his mission, his identity, his direction, as if to say, without direct words, you are still who I called you to be. And here's a point that transforms everything. Many people turn away from God, not because he has turned away, but because they believe they are no longer worthy to draw near. But this story shows exactly the opposite. God's presence draws even closer when someone is broken inside. Not to reinforce guilt, but to rebuild what was lost. And perhaps at this moment there is something inside you that needs to be restored. Something you think you've lost, something you believe there's no turning back. But the same presence that Peter found at that moment is still accessible. And when this encounter happens, the identity is restored, the purpose is rekindled, and the path makes sense again. And if as you were listening to this, someone came to your mind, someone who needs this restoration, someone who needs this presence, maybe this is not a random thought. Write that person's name in the comments. It may be simple, but it connects you to a chain of faith, where lives are remembered before God with hope and confidence that something can change. And then, after all that has been revealed so far, something even deeper happens. Something that completely changes the way we understand God's presence, because until that moment, this presence was perceived on the side, in meetings, in demonstrations, at specific moments. But there is a promise that takes everything to another level, a dimension where God is not only near, he starts to dwell within. Before leaving, Jesus made it clear that something extraordinary was going to happen. In Acts 1:8, it is written, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you." This is not just a promise of strength, it is a change of reality. Because when the Holy Spirit comes, God's presence ceases to be something external and becomes internal, constant, alive in every detail of life. This means that the direction does not only come from the outside, it begins to be perceived inside. That soft voice, that inexplicable peace, that silent conviction, all of this becomes part of the daily life of those who are connected with this presence. And here is something that many have not yet fully understood. The Holy Spirit is not just a force, he is an active presence, he is a relationship. He is someone who guides, teaches, corrects, and strengthens. In times of doubt, he directs. In times of weakness, he sustains. In moments of decision, he brings clarity. Not in a confused or distant way, but in a personal, intimate, constant way. And this completely changes the way of living, because it is no longer a matter of seeking God only at specific moments, but of walking with the awareness that he is within, participating in every choice, every thought, every step. Faith ceases to be something occasional and becomes an ongoing experience. God's presence no longer depends on the environment. It manifests itself from the inside out. And perhaps the deepest of all this is to understand that this transformation does not happen superficially. The Holy Spirit works on the inside, aligning thoughts, restoring emotions, strengthening decisions. What used to generate confusion is beginning to gain clarity. What once seemed impossible is starting to become possible. Not by human effort, but by an internal action that shapes everything in a silent but real way. And when someone starts to live like this, something changes in the way they see life. The circumstances still exist, the challenges continue, but there is a different security, a peace that does not depend on what is happening around you. Because now it's not just about believing that God is with you, but about living with the assurance that He is in you. Nothing happens by chance. If you've made it this far, there's a purpose to it. Continue to the end, because there is still something being prepared, something that can deeply touch your heart and strengthen your walk in a way that you may not have experienced yet. And after understanding that this presence now dwells within, one of life's most real challenges arises: how to move forward when you don't know exactly where to go. Because there are times when everything seems uncertain, where there are no clear answers, where the path is not drawn as we would like. And it is exactly in this kind of scenario that the story of Abraham begins to take on an even deeper meaning. He did not receive a detailed plan, he did not have complete explanations, he did not see the destination before starting the hike. He only heard a voice. In Genesis 12:1 it is written, "Now the Lord said to Abram, Go out of your country, from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land that I will show you." Notice something important here. God does not show the earth first, and then ask for movement. He asks for the move before revealing the destination. This completely breaks human logic, because the natural tendency is to want security before acting, clarity before deciding, guarantees before moving forward. But divine direction works differently. It is not based on seeing everything, but on trusting enough to take the next step. Abraham did not walk because he understood everything. He walked because he trusted the one who spoke. And this reveals one of the deepest secrets of God's presence. It often manifests itself not through complete explanations, but through simple but firm direction. And maybe that's speaking directly to something that you're living right now. That doubt about which path to follow, that feeling of being stopped because you don't have all the answers, that fear of making a decision without being absolutely sure. But this story shows that total clarity doesn't always come before movement. It is built along the way. God does not lead like a map open before the eyes. He leads like a light that illuminates only the next step. And this requires something that goes beyond logic. It requires faith. Not a faith based on visible certainties, but an inner conviction that even without seeing everything, you are not walking alone. Abraham left what was comfortable, known, predictable, to follow something he could not yet see. And it is exactly at this point that many get stuck, because leaving the known requires courage, but staying still often costs even more. God's presence does not completely eliminate doubt, but it offers something greater than doubt, enough direction to continue. And when someone decides to trust in this way, something begins to change. Small signs appear. Paths begin to line up. Doors that were previously closed begin to open. Not all at once, but at the right time, in the right measure, exactly as God leads. And maybe what you need today is not all the answers, but just the courage to take the next step. Because God's presence isn't waiting for you to understand everything. It's waiting for you to trust enough to keep going. And then, as this journey continues, an even more sensitive point arises, because it does not only involve decisions or paths, but something that is kept inside the heart, and that many times no one sees. They are old wounds, memories that still hurt, situations that have deeply marked, and that, even with the passage of time, continue to occupy space. Joseph knew this kind of pain. He was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, wronged again and again, forgotten when he most needed to be remembered. Humanly, he had every reason to carry hurt, to close himself off, to never trust again. But his story doesn't end in pain, and that's exactly what makes it so powerful. Because when the moment of reunion comes, when he is finally in front of those who caused all that, something unexpected happens. At Genesis 50:20 he states, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." This phrase is not just an answer, it is a revelation. Jose does not deny what happened, he does not erase the past, but he sees everything from a completely different perspective. And here is one of the deepest secrets of soul healing. It does not happen when someone forgets what they have experienced, but when they come to understand that God can transform even what was painful into something that has a purpose. Forgiveness, in this context, ceases to be a heavy obligation and becomes a liberation. Because while there is hurt, there is weight. As long as there is resentment, there is emotional prison. Joseph could have chosen revenge, he could have used his position to repay in equal measure, but he chooses something greater. He chooses not to carry what no longer made sense to continue inside him. And that doesn't mean it was easy, it means it was necessary. Because God's presence does not work in a heart that is stuck in the past, but in a heart that decides to open itself to something new. And perhaps this is a point that touches directly on the lives of many people. That situation that still bothers you, that memory that insists on coming back, that pain that has never been completely resolved. But this story reveals that there is a way, a path that does not erase the past, but completely changes its meaning. When someone decides to forgive, they are not saying that what happened was right, they are saying that they will no longer allow it to control the present. And it is exactly at this moment that something begins to change inside. A lightness arises, a peace begins to occupy the space that was previously heavy, and the soul finds rest. And perhaps, as you listen to this, something inside you is being played silently. Maybe there's something that needs to be released, something that needs to be delivered, and if that word has found that place within you, even if in a simple way, write in the comments, "I trust in God." Sometimes a small sentence carries a big decision, and it can be the beginning of a real transformation. And after understanding that even wounds can be transformed, an even more confrontational truth emerges, because distancing does not always happen because of others, is often the result of one's own choices. Jonah knew exactly what God had asked for. There was no doubt, there was no confusion, there was clarity. Even so, he decided to go in the opposite direction, as if it were possible to distance himself from something that is impossible to avoid. And perhaps this sounds more familiar than it sounds, because there are times when the heart knows what the path is, but still chooses to run away, postpone, ignore. Jonah embarks on a contrary route, trying to create distance from what God had determined. For a while, it seems like everything is under control, but soon reality begins to change. The storm arises, the scenario becomes chaotic, and what seemed like a simple choice begins to reveal profound consequences, until he is thrown into the sea and swallowed by a large fish. And it is there, in the most unlikely place, in the depths, in the dark, in absolute silence, that something finally happens. In Jonah 2:2 it is written, "In my distress I cried out to the Lord, and he answered me." This moment reveals something powerful. It wasn't in comfort. It wasn't when everything was fine. It was at rock bottom that Jonas decided to cry out. And this shows that there is no place where God's presence cannot reach. No matter how far one thinks one has gone, no matter how deep the situation, connection is still possible. And here's a point that changes everything. Reconnection doesn't require perfection, it requires sincerity. Jonah did not present an elaborate speech, he did not try to justify his choices, he simply cried out. And God answered. This breaks the idea that one must be in an ideal state to get closer. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It is in the moment of greatest fragility, of greater awareness of error, that the heart opens in a truest way. Rock bottom, which is often seen as the end, can become the meeting point. Because when everything around is removed, when there are no more distractions, when there is nowhere else to run, the gaze finally turns to that which has always been present. And at that moment, something begins to change from the inside out. Jonah was still inside the fish when he decided to cry out. The external situation had not yet changed, but something within him had already changed. This shows that God's response does not begin on the outside, it begins within. Restoration begins in the heart before it manifests itself in circumstances. And maybe somehow this message is reaching exactly a place that you don't usually show to anyone. Maybe there is a tiredness, a distance, a feeling of disconnection, but this story reveals that there is still a way, there is still an answer, there is still presence. If you are here, it is not by chance. There is something being aligned, something being awakened within you, and there is still more to be revealed. Stay until the end, because what comes next can bring clarity that you may have been looking for a long time. And then, after realizing that there is always a way back, something even more intense arises, because it is not just about going back, but about waking up. There are times when life goes into a kind of autopilot, where everything seems normal on the outside, but on the inside there is a silent disconnect. It is not an overt rebellion, it is not a clear escape. It is something more subtle, like a spiritual numbness. And it is exactly in this scenario that God raises voices that cannot be ignored. John the Baptist appears in the desert with a direct message, without beating around the bush, without softening his words. At Matthew 3:2 he states, "Repent, you people, because the kingdom of the heavens is at hand." This is not just a phrase, it is an urgent call. Not for later, not for when it is more convenient, not for a future moment. It's a now. And this is confronting because it breaks the idea that there will always be more time, more opportunities, more chances to decide. What John was announcing was not just a change in behavior, but an alignment with a new spiritual reality. He was saying that something had already begun, that the time for ignoring, postponing, or living absent-mindedly had come to an end. And this urgency does not come from fear, it comes from truth. Because when God manifests himself more intensely, he also calls more clearly. And perhaps this is one of the hardest parts to accept. Because awakening requires decision. It's not just feeling something, it's not just agreeing with an idea, it's choosing to change direction. It is realizing that some things need to be left, that others need to be adjusted, that there is a new position being requested. And this does not happen automatically, it happens when someone responds. God's presence becomes more evident when there is readiness, when the heart stops resisting and begins to align. Because it's not just about listening to the message, it's about allowing it to produce movement. John the Baptist was not concerned with pleasing, he was committed to awakening. And that same urgency keeps echoing, often in different ways, at unexpected moments, in words that touch deeper than usual. And maybe this moment is one of those. Not by chance, not by coincidence, but because there is something being called to attention within you. Something that may have been ignored for a while, postponed, put on the back burner. But now it comes back with more force, asking for an answer. Because spiritual time does not work like human time. He does not wait indefinitely. There is a moment when the decision needs to be made, when the heart needs to choose whether to continue in the same way or if it will respond to the call. And if this word has found space within you, even if silently, maybe it's time to express it in a simple but true way. Write in the comments, Amen. Not as repetition, but as an acknowledgement that God has been good, that He is speaking, that something within you is awakening now. And it is at this point in the journey that something begins to overflow, because when the presence of God really touches someone, it is not hidden. It does not remain silent. It is not limited to the interior. The transformation becomes visible, perceptible, alive. The Samaritan woman was not in a high spiritual moment when she encountered Jesus. On the contrary, she carried a history marked by mistakes, rejections, and a constant search for something that was never completed. She goes to the well at an unusual time, avoiding people, avoiding looks, perhaps trying to avoid judgment. But in that meeting, something happens that completely changes the course of his story. Jesus doesn't just talk to her, he reveals what no one else knew. He touches deep areas of her life, not to expose, but to restore. And the most impressive thing is not only what he says, but the effect it causes, because after that moment, she can't stay the same anymore. In John 4:29, she runs back and declares, "Come, see a man who has told me all that I have done." Notice that she does not present an elaborate speech, does not bring theological arguments, does not try to convince with complex words. She simply shares what she has experienced. And this carries a force that cannot be ignored. True testimony has that power. It doesn't come from theory, it comes from experience. It doesn't depend on perfection, it depends on truth. And that's exactly why it has an impact. Because when someone speaks of what he really lived with God, there is a spiritual authority that surpasses any logical explanation. And here is something that transforms the way we see life itself. God's presence doesn't just want to change you, it wants to use your story as a tool to reach others. What you have experienced, even the difficult parts, can become bridges to touch other people who are going through similar situations. Nothing is wasted when God enters the story. The Samaritan woman was not stuck in what she was, she started to live from what she found. And this caused an entire city to be impacted. It all started with a date, but it didn't end in it. It spread, reached, transformed others. This shows that when someone really meets Jesus, it is not limited, it becomes movement. And maybe, in some way, you have already experienced something with God, something that marked, something that touched you deeply, but that was kept, forgotten, or even silenced. But this story shows that what God does is not just to be remembered, it is to be shared, lived actively, because living testimony is not just about telling what happened, it is about living in a way that reveals that transformation. It is to carry within oneself evidence that something has changed, and to allow it to reach others naturally. This word is not for everyone. If you are here, it is because God wants to reveal something special to you. Continue to the end, because there is something being prepared that can further open your understanding and strengthen your walk in a way that you may not have experienced yet. And this is where the journey reaches an even deeper level, because we are no longer just talking about decisions, encounters, or experiences, but about something that completely changes who the person is inside. Saul's story is one of the most impactful in this sense, because he was not someone lost without direction. He was convinced, determined, active, but he was walking in the wrong direction. He believed he was doing the right thing, while in fact he was standing against what God was doing. This reveals something important. Not every appearance of conviction means alignment with God. And this is exactly why the transformation he accomplishes is not superficial. When Saul has that encounter on the road to Damascus, there is not only a change in behavior, there is an internal rupture. Everything he believed in, everything that motivated him, everything that guided his actions, begins to be rebuilt. In Acts 9:15, God declares something that breaks any human expectation. "This is a chosen vessel to me." This statement is not based on what Saul was doing at that moment, but on what he could become. And here's one of the deepest secrets of God's presence. He doesn't just look at the visible present, he sees the hidden potential. This completely changes the way we understand life itself, because many times someone is defined by the past, by mistakes, by choices, by limitations. But God works in another dimension. He sees beyond. He sees that which has not yet been revealed, that which has not yet taken shape, that which is still being built. Saul's transformation into Paul was not immediate in the outward sense. There was a process, there was learning, there was growth, but something essential had already changed inside. The direction of life was changed, the purpose was redefined, the identity began to be reconstructed. And this shows that true transformation does not begin on the outside, it begins within. And perhaps this is a point that needs to be understood in depth, because many people try to change only behaviors, only external attitudes, but they continue to carry the same thoughts, the same intentions, the same internal patterns, and while this does not change, the transformation is not sustained. When God enters the story, He doesn't just adjust details, He rebuilds the foundation. It changes the way we think, feel, decide. What used to make sense no longer does. What was previously not perceived becomes clear. It is a change that does not depend on constant effort, but on an internal alignment that begins to produce new fruits naturally. And this reveals something essential. No one is limited to what they are today. There is always a deeper level, a restored version, a greater purpose being prepared. God's presence not only accompanies the journey, it redefines the destination. And as this inner transformation takes place, a need arises that many ignore, but which is essential to sustain all that has been built so far, because the spiritual walk was not made to be solitary. There is a point where God's presence is no longer perceived only individually and begins to manifest itself collectively through connection with other people who share the same faith. The early church clearly reveals this, not as a theory, but as a way of life. In Acts 2:42 it is written, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, in fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in prayers." This shows that there was constancy, there was commitment, there was unity. It was not something occasional, it was an ongoing practice. And it is exactly in this union that something different happens. God's presence manifests itself with intensity when there is alignment among those who believe. Because when people come together with the same purpose, the same faith, the same search, something is strengthened from the inside out. And here's a point that's often overlooked. Isolated faith may even exist, but it weakens over time. Because there are times when someone needs support, needs a word, needs someone to walk together. And it is in communion that this happens. It is not just about being physically close, but about sharing life, experiences, prayers, learning. God's presence also reveals itself in this environment of connection. In simple conversations, in moments of prayer together, in words that arrive at the right time, in support when everything seems difficult. God uses people to reach people. It manifests itself not only in individual silence, but also in collective unity. And perhaps this explains why, in many moments, when someone moves away from everything and everyone, the walk becomes heavier. Not because God has moved away, but because the person has disconnected from one of the means He uses to strengthen, sustain, and direct. Communion is not a detail, it is an essential part of the process. The early church was not perfect, but it was united. And this unity created an environment where God's presence was constant, perceptible, alive. There was growth, there was transformation, there was support. Each one contributed, each one participated, each one was part of something bigger. And perhaps at this moment this is bringing an important reflection about connections, about proximity, about the way the journey has been lived, because no one was called to walk alone. There is strength in unity, there is direction in communion, there is God's presence being revealed through aligned relationships with Him. And if this message reminded you that other people need that same hope too, maybe this is the time to take action. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel and activating the bell, you help this word to reach those in need, becoming an instrument for more lives to be touched and strengthened in this same walk of faith. And as this journey progresses, one of the deepest barriers begins to be confronted, not from the outside, but within the mind itself. Because there are limitations that were not imposed by circumstances, but built by the way someone sees themselves. Gideon lived just like that. He didn't see himself as someone capable. He didn't consider himself strong. He didn't believe he could do something relevant. On the contrary, his view of himself was marked by insecurity, comparison, and a sense of inferiority. When God finds him, Gideon is in hiding, trying to preserve what little he had, living in a limited way, trying to survive in the midst of a difficult scenario. And it is in this context that something unexpected happens. In Judges 6:12, the statement comes directly, "The Lord is with thee, O mighty man of value." This phrase does not describe who Gideon believed himself to be, but it does reveal who God saw in him. And here is one of the most transformative points of this journey. God does not call someone based on self-perception. He calls based on the vision that he himself has. Gideon saw weakness. God saw potential. Gideon saw limitation. God saw ability. Gideon saw impossibility. God saw purpose. This completely changes the way of understanding the calling, because many times someone believes that they need to be ready, prepared, confident, safe in order to be used by God. But this story shows exactly the opposite. God calls first, empowers later. He does not wait for everything to be perfect. He begins the process from what already exists, even if it seems little. And the most interesting thing is that Gideon does not accept this immediately. He questions, he doubts, he asks for signs. This shows that doubt does not hinder God's action, but also reveals that there is a process of building trust. Gradually, Gideon begins to realize that it is not about his strength, but about the presence that is with him. The Lord is with thee. That's the basis of everything. Because when this truth becomes real, the limitation begins to lose strength. Not because the person suddenly becomes perfect, but because they come to understand that they are not alone. God's presence begins to fill the spaces where there was once fear, insecurity, doubt. And maybe that's speaking directly to something that you upload, that feeling of not being enough, of not being ready, of not being able to do it. But this story reveals that what you see in yourself does not define what God can do through you. There is a potential that has not yet been activated. There is a purpose that has not yet been fully revealed. When God calls, he already considers what you cannot yet see. And it is exactly at this point that the transformation begins. Insecurity begins to give way to courage, not because everything has become easy, but because God's presence becomes greater than any limitation. And as this journey progresses, an even more subtle challenge arises, because it's not just about listening, it's about acknowledging. In the midst of so many thoughts, opinions, emotions, and influences, how do you know when God is speaking? How do we distinguish the divine voice among so many other voices that compete for attention every day? Samuel lives exactly this moment, still young, sensitive, available, but without enough experience to discern what was happening. During the night, he hears a voice calling his name. He gets up, runs to Eli, thinking that he was the one who had called. This happens more than once. Samuel listens, answers, but does not understand. And this reveals something very important. It is possible to listen and still not recognize it. Not for lack of God speaking, but for lack of discernment to identify, until, guided by Eli, he finally understands how to respond. And then, in 1 Samuel 3:10, he says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." This sentence marks a turning point, not just because he listened, but because he positioned himself to listen consciously. There is a difference between distracted listening and listening with intention, and here is one of the most profound points of this journey. God keeps speaking, But few are really paying attention, not because they don't want to, but because the indoor environment is too crowded. Racing thoughts, constant worries, daily distractions, all this creates a type of noise that makes it difficult to perceive what is most subtle. God's voice doesn't have to be loud to be clear, but it does require sensitivity. And this sensitivity is not born automatically, it is developed through intimacy, silence, the willingness to stop and pay attention. It's not about complicated techniques, it's about creating space. Because when there is space, perception changes. Samuel had to learn to recognize. And this also shows that this process is built. No one is born knowing how to discern perfectly, but everyone can learn. The closer one comes to God, the more familiar that voice becomes. And what once seemed confusing begins to gain clarity. And maybe that's a point that's making sense right now. Because there are times when the doubt is not a lack of answer, but difficulty in recognizing the answer that has already been given. God speaks through impressions, convictions, inner peace, even through situations. But you have to be careful. When one begins to develop this discernment, the walk changes. Decisions become more aligned, paths clearer, and the feeling of being lost begins to diminish. Not because all the answers appear at once, but because the direction becomes more noticeable. If this message brought confirmation to something you were already feeling, maybe it's time to state it simply. Write in the comments, God cares for me. Sometimes acknowledging this truth is the first step to starting to hear more clearly. And as this spiritual sensitivity begins to develop, something new begins to happen on the journey. It's no longer just about listening or discerning, but about realizing that God is communicating all the time, in ways that often go unnoticed. Because His presence is not silent in the sense of absence, it leaves marks, signs, directions along the way. The people of Israel lived this in a visible, concrete way, impossible to ignore. In Exodus 13:21 it is written, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud, and by night in a pillar of fire." This means that they did not walk without direction. There was a clear, constant sign that indicated the way. During the day, the cloud protected, guided, showed where to go. During the night, the fire illuminated, brought security, revealed the next step. God not only said He would be with them, He demonstrated it in a practical, visible, daily way. And here's something very important to understand. God's signs will not always be as great as they were then, but that does not mean that they do not exist. On the contrary, they are still present, only in more subtle ways. A direction that comes at the right time, a door that opens when it seemed impossible, a peace that comes even without explanation. A word that arrives exactly when it was needed. The problem is not the absence of signs, it is the lack of attention to perceive them. Because when the mind is too busy, when the heart is distracted, when haste takes over, even that which is clear can go unnoticed. And that is why this journey requires more than just faith. It requires attention. The people of Israel needed to watch the cloud. When it moved, they moved. When she stopped, they stopped. This shows that it is not enough to see the sign, it is necessary to respond to it. There is a part that depends on perception, but there is also a part that depends on obedience. And perhaps this is an essential point to understand today. God keeps guiding, keeps directing, keeps leaving evidence of His presence along the way. But it is necessary to perceive, interpret, and act. Because the sign points, but you are the one who decides to walk. And when someone starts living that way, something changes completely. The journey is no longer confusing. Decisions begin to have more clarity, and that feeling of being lost is replaced by constant direction. Not because everything is easy, but because there is an awareness that God is guiding every step. And perhaps, at this moment, you have already received signs. You have already perceived small directions, but you have not yet fully understood what that meant. And this can change from now on, because when spiritual eyes are opened, what once seemed ordinary starts to carry meaning. What you will hear now may be the exact answer God wants to give you, but many let it pass because they are not attentive at the right time. Continue until the end, because what comes next can bring clarity that you haven't noticed yet, but that can completely transform the way you see your journey. And it is at this point in the journey that faith ceases to be just an idea and starts to be put to the test in a real, concrete, almost uncomfortable way. Because believing when everything is favorable is easy, but the real test happens when resources are limited and the need is great. A hungry crowd, an isolated place, no structure, no visible solution. And in the middle of it all, only 5 loaves and 2 fish in the hands of a boy. Humanly, that wasn't even enough to begin with. But it is exactly in this scenario that Jesus reveals something that goes beyond logic. In Matthew 14:19 it is written, "And when he had commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and lifted up his eyes to heaven, and blessed them." Before any multiplication takes place, there is a gesture that many ignore. He looks up to the sky and blesses the little. This shows that the miracle does not begin when everything increases. It begins when what exists is delivered. And here is one of the most profound points of this journey. True faith does not deny reality. It recognizes limitation, but chooses not to stop at it. The disciples saw scarcity. They saw impossibility. They saw lack. Jesus saw an opportunity to reveal something greater, and this difference in vision completely changes the result. Because many times the thought is to wait for more to then act, to wait to have enough to trust, to wait to have guarantees to move forward. But this moment shows that God does not need much. He starts with little. What he seeks is not quantity, it is surrender. When what seems insufficient is placed in the right hands, it ceases to be a limitation and becomes a starting point. And maybe that's speaking directly to something that you have today, something that seems small, insufficient, incapable of generating results. It can be an appeal, an opportunity, a decision, even faith itself. But this story reveals that size does not define potential. What defines it is where it is placed. Jesus did not ignore the little, he used the little. And in doing so, he showed that God's presence is capable of completely transforming any scenario. The multiplication was not just of food, it was of understanding. It was proof that what seems limited in human hands becomes unlimited when it passes through God's hands. And the multitude was fed, not because there was abundance at the beginning, but because there was surrender. This is the point that changes everything. Unshakable faith is not born when everything is resolved. It is born when someone decides to trust even without seeing how it will happen. And when that trust becomes real, something starts to move. Small things begin to grow, paths begin to emerge, solutions appear in unexpected ways. Not because everything changed suddenly, but because God's presence entered into what previously seemed insufficient. And when this faith begins to be exercised, even in the face of scarcity, another challenge arises that touches even deeper: time. Because it's not just about believing when there's little, but continuing to believe when it feels like it's taking too long. Sarah knew this place. She received a clear, direct promise, impossible to be confused. But time passed, the years advanced, and what was said seemed increasingly distant from reality. The body no longer responded. The circumstances did not help. And logic said that there was no longer any possibility. It was at that moment that something human happened. She laughed. It was not a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of doubt, of incredulity, of someone who could no longer see how it could be fulfilled. And perhaps this is more common than it seems, because there are promises, dreams, prayers that over time begin to lose strength within the heart. Not because they are no longer important, but because they seem increasingly unlikely. But God does not work limited by human time. In Genesis 21:1 it is written, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised." This shows that the promise was not forgotten, it was not cancelled, it was not delayed in the divine sense. It was being prepared, aligned, conducted within a time that does not depend on human haste. And here is one of the most profound points of this journey. God's presence not only promises, it sustains as long as the promise is not manifested. Because the interval between what has been said and what is fulfilled is where faith is built, strengthened, tested. It is not an empty time, it is a time of process. Sarah looked at her own limitation and laughed. God looked at the purpose and fulfilled it. This reveals that visible reality does not define the final result. What God declares does not depend on circumstances. It depends on His faithfulness. And this fidelity does not fail, does not change, is not lost over time. And perhaps this is the point that needs to be understood now. That which seems to be standing still is not standing still. What seems forgotten has not been forgotten. God continues to work behind the scenes, even when there are no clear signs. There is an invisible movement happening, aligning details, preparing the right moment. The promise does not depend on what you see today, but on what God has already established. And when the time is right, nothing can stop it. Neither age, nor circumstances, nor apparent limitations. Because when God chooses to deliver, He does exactly as He promised. And maybe there's something in your heart that fits that right now. Something you've already asked for, something you've already believed, but over time you've become more distant. But this word carries a silent invitation. Do not give up on what God has already said. And if there's something inside of you that needs to be put before God again, maybe that's the time. Write in the comments your prayer request, what is in your heart, without filters, without fear. Because when faith comes together, when there is agreement, something begins to move differently, and what seemed impossible begins to find a new path. And it is precisely when time seems to have taken away what was most important that another dimension of faith begins to be revealed, because there are losses that cannot be ignored, pains that cannot be disguised, and moments in which emptiness seems to occupy everything. Ruth lives exactly this scenario. She loses, she faces grief, she finds herself facing an uncertain future, without guarantees, without clear direction. Humanly, everything indicated a lonely new beginning, a path without many expectations. But it is at this point that a silent decision completely changes the course of the story. At Ruth 1:16, she declares, "Your people will be my people, your God will be my God." This choice was not based on convenience. It was not motivated by security. It was a decision to stay, even when all seemed lost. And this is exactly where something profound happens. The hope that transforms is not born when everything is fine. It is born when someone decides to continue even without fully understanding. Ruth had no guarantees that everything would work out, but she had enough conviction not to give up. And this reveals a powerful principle. God's presence is manifested in faithfulness, often silent, often invisible, but constant. While many could have gone back, given up, or chosen the easy way out, Ruth remains. And this permanence is not only physical, it is spiritual. It is a decision to trust, to follow, not to abandon what, and it is in this kind of posture that God begins to act in a profound way. Because what seemed like the end was actually the beginning of something new. The history that began with loss begins to be rewritten with purpose. What seemed empty begins to be filled with direction. And little by little, what was pain begins to give way to something bigger, more meaningful, more in line with what God had already prepared. This shows that God does not depend on perfect scenarios to act. It begins right where it all seems to have ended. He builds new paths from moments that seemed like definitive endings, and this completely changes the way we see our own losses. Because not everything that ends is the end. Some things end because something new needs to begin. And even if at first this is not clear, even if the process is difficult, there is a construction happening. There is a story being written differently. Ruth didn't see everything right away, but she walked. And as she walked, she was led to a destination she would never have imagined. This reveals that true hope is not in what has already been lost, but in what can still be built from it. God's presence does not abandon at the moment of loss. It becomes even more essential, guiding each step towards something that, at the right time, will make sense. And when this hope begins to be rebuilt, there comes a time when faith needs to take a firmer position, because there are battles that cannot be avoided, only faced. Davy arrives exactly in this scenario. A battlefield, two armies stalled, a giant challenging every day, and a silence full of fear dominating those who should advance. Everyone saw the same problem, everyone heard the same threats, but only one saw something different. Goliath was not only big in size, he represented intimidation, pressure, impossibility, and for days, no one had the courage to face him. This reveals something very real. Fear can paralyze even those who have the capacity, experience, and resources. But then David appears, someone without armor, without the appearance of a warrior, without preparation according to human standards. And yet, something inside him was bigger than what was in front of him. In 1 Samuel 17:47, David declares, "For war is the Lord's, and he will deliver you into our hand." This sentence reveals what made all the difference. David was not trusting himself. He was aware of who was with him. While everyone saw an impossible giant to beat, David saw an opportunity to reveal the power of God. And here is one of the strongest points of this journey. True victory does not begin with strength. It begins with presence, consciousness. When someone understands that they are not alone, that there is a greater force at work, fear begins to lose space. It doesn't disappear automatically, but it no longer has control. David did not ignore the size of the giant, but he also did not allow it to define his decision. He moved forward with what he had, with a faith that depended not on appearance or approval or logic. And that changes everything, because many times the person believes that they need to be totally ready, fully equipped, totally safe in order to act. But this story shows that the most important thing is not what is in the hands, but who is guiding the heart. God did not choose David because he was the most prepared according to human eyes, but because he trusted. And that trust activates something that can't be measured. The stone thrown was not just a physical movement, it was an expression of faith aligned with the presence of God. And when that happens, what seemed impossible starts to fall. Not because the problem has diminished, but because faith has taken a stand. Spiritual victory begins at this very point, when fear loses its voice and faith takes control of decisions. And maybe there's a giant before you right now. Something that seems too big, too difficult, impossible to face. But this story reveals that the size of the challenge does not define the outcome. The presence of God does. When you understand this, something changes inside, and that change begins to reflect on the outside. If this word touched you deeply, as if it were speaking directly to your reality, perhaps this is not by chance. There is a purpose in this. And if you feel this in your heart, write in the comments, "God chose me." Sometimes, acknowledging this truth is the first step to experiencing something you haven't experienced yet. And it is at this point that the journey stops being just about what happens inside you and begins to expand into something bigger, something that involves other lives, other destinations, other stories. Because there comes a time when faith is not just to sustain, but to take a stand. Esther lives exactly this scenario. She was not in an ordinary place. She occupied a strategic position, but for a long time that seemed just a detail of her story. Until everything changes. A decree is issued, a real threat arises, and what was once just a comfortable position becomes a point of decision. Esther could remain silent, she could protect herself, she could avoid risk. But then comes a word that pierces any doubt. In Esther 4:14 it is written, "And who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this?" This phrase is not just a question, it is an awakening. She reveals that nothing is by chance, that every position, every moment, every opportunity can carry a greater purpose. And it is exactly at this point that intercession takes on a new meaning. Because it is not just a matter of praying for something far away, but of standing as a bridge, as someone who stands up in favor of others, even when it requires courage. Esther understands that it wasn't just about her, it was about an entire people. And this completely changes his posture. She decides to fast, to pray, to prepare, but most of all, she decides to act. To intercede is not to be passive, it is to assume a spiritual responsibility. It is to say, even in the face of risk, that something needs to be done. And here is one of the strongest points of this revelation. God's presence manifests itself powerfully when someone chooses not to ignore the call, when someone realizes that they can make a difference and chooses not to omit themselves. Because there are situations that only change when someone gets up, and maybe that's speaking directly to you right now. Because there are people around you, situations that you know, realities that you perceive, where you can be that point of intercession. Not by chance, not by coincidence, but because you were placed exactly in that place, at that time. Esther had no guarantees of how it would all end, but she had enough conviction to take a stand. And when she does that, something starts moving. What seemed defined begins to be changed. What seemed inevitable begins to change direction. Because when someone stands up with courage, aligned with the presence of God, destinies can be transformed. And maybe there's something being awakened within you right now, a sense of responsibility, a realization that you can do more than you realize. Because intercession isn't about having all the answers, it's about being willing to put yourself in the gap. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time. And this moment may be exactly what God is using to show you that you're not just waiting, you've also been called to act. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can show you more clearly the role you play in this journey. And as this spiritual responsibility is revealed, one of the most difficult scenarios to understand arises, because pain does not always come with an explanation, nor does suffering always make sense at the moment it happens. Job represents this place in an intense way. He didn't just lose something, he lost everything. Your assets, your family, your health, your stability, everything that sustained his life was suddenly removed, without warning, without apparent logic. And perhaps the hardest thing was not only the loss itself, but the silence that accompanied it. The absence of clear answers, the feeling of facing something I couldn't understand. Because there are times when pain is not accompanied by explanations, and this can generate an even greater weight. But it is exactly in this scenario that one of the strongest statements of faith appears. In Job 19:25 he states, "For I know that my Redeemer lives." Notice that he doesn't say he understands everything. He doesn't say he's fine. He doesn't say the pain is over. He says he knows. There is a conviction that remains even when everything around you is falling apart. And this reveals something profound. True consolation does not depend on the absence of pain, but on the certainty that God is still present. Job did not deny suffering, he expressed, questioned, felt. But in the midst of all this, he did not lose the reference of who God is. And that makes all the difference, because when one relies solely on what God does, faith can fluctuate as circumstances change. But when trust is in who God is, there is a stability that suffering cannot destroy. God's presence in this case did not immediately remove the pain, but sustained Job's soul so that he would not break completely. And this shows that, in many moments, the greatest miracle is not the change in the situation, but the ability to remain standing even within it. And maybe that's speaking directly to something that you're living right now. A difficult moment, a phase of loss, a situation that has not yet found an answer. But this story reveals that, even when everything seems uncertain, there is a constant presence that sustains, that strengthens, that keeps hope alive, even if silently. Divine consolation is not superficial. It reaches within, touches where no one else can touch, and brings a peace that does not depend on what is happening outside. It is something that sustains, that involves, that keeps the person firm even when everything seems unstable. And when this truth begins to be understood, something changes. The pain may continue for a while, but it no longer has the same power. Because there is a greater certainty occupying space, a certainty that God has not moved away, that He is still present, that there is a purpose even when it is not yet possible to see. If this message has reached you at this moment, perhaps there is something being worked on within your heart. And if you want to continue receiving words that strengthen, that direct, and that bring that peace in the midst of difficulties, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. This may be what will keep you connected with what God still wants to reveal in your walk. And it is precisely after understanding that God sustains, even in the most difficult moments, that something begins to emerge from within, something that goes beyond pain, beyond loss, beyond the situation itself, because there are times when adversity doesn't just come to hurt, but to reveal. Nehemiah receives news that could simply generate sadness and conformism. Jerusalem was destroyed, its walls torn down, its gates burned. It was a scene of complete ruin, something that many would look at and think, there is nothing more to do. But in Nehemiah, this news did not only generate sadness, it generated a burden, a nuisance that could not be ignored, something that started as pain but quickly turned into purpose. He didn't go directly into action, he first took a stand spiritually. He cried, prayed, fasted. This reveals that when God begins to awaken a purpose, He also begins within, aligning the heart before directing the steps. And then something changes. What was once just information becomes a mission. At Nehemiah 2:18 he declares, "Let us arise and build." This phrase marks the beginning of a reconstruction that is not only physical, but spiritual. Because God was not only interested in restoring walls, but in raising up people willing to rebuild what had been lost. And here is one of the most profound points of this journey. God's purpose is often born in the very place of pain. That which bothers you, that which weighs you down, that which seems unfair, may be the point where God is calling someone to act, not to complain, not to give up, but to get up. Nehemiah could have ignored it, he could have gone on with his life, but he understood that this situation was not just a problem, it was a calling, and that completely changes the perspective, because when someone understands their purpose, obstacles stop being barriers and become part of the process. And it wasn't easy. There was opposition, criticism, attempts at discouragement. But when the purpose is clear, resistance does not paralyze. It only confirms that something important is being done. God's presence did not remove all challenges, but it did give Nehemiah the strength, strategy, and perseverance to keep going. And maybe that's speaking directly to something inside of you right now, something that bothers you, something you see and feel you need to change, something you can't ignore. This may not just be a passing emotion, it may be a sign of purpose being awakened, because God keeps raising people up in times of ruin, people who do not accept to remain as they are, who decide to act, rebuild, restore. And it all starts with this moment, when pain is no longer just suffering and becomes direction. And when someone responds to that call, something begins to be rebuilt, not only around, but within as well. Because purpose doesn't just change situations, it transforms those who decide to live it. And when that purpose begins to be awakened, there comes a moment when the reality around it seems so broken that hope begins to fade. It's not just difficulty, it's a scenario that seems lifeless, without possibility, without a future. Ezekiel is taken to exactly this kind of place, a valley full of dry bones, scattered, disconnected, completely lifeless. There was no movement, no sign of restoration, just a clear portrait of something that had already ended. And maybe that represents something very real, because there are areas of life that look exactly like that. Situations that were once full of life, but today seem dry, distant, without a solution. Relationships, dreams, projects, even faith itself. And in view of this, the tendency is to accept that it is over, that there is nothing more to do. But then God asks a question that changes everything. He asks Ezekiel if those bones could come back to life. Humanly, the answer would be no. Everything there indicated an end. But Ezekiel responds in a different way. He does not rely on what he sees, he recognizes who God is. And it is exactly at this point that the renewal begins. In Ezekiel 37:5 it is written, "Behold, I will bring the Spirit into you, and you shall live." This reveals something that goes beyond logic. God is not limited to what has already died. He has the power to recreate, to restore, to bring life where there is no longer any evidence of possibility. And here is one of the most profound points of this journey. Spiritual renewal begins when one's vision changes. Not when the situation changes first, but when someone starts to see beyond what is in front of their eyes. Because as long as vision is stuck only in the visible, hope is limited. But when the vision aligns with what God can do, something begins to open up. Ezekiel begins to prophesy, to declare life where there was only death. And little by little, what seemed impossible begins to move. The bones come together, take shape, receive life. This shows that God's presence not only restores what already existed, but recreates that which seemed completely lost. And maybe that's speaking directly to something inside of you, something you once considered lost, something you have already left behind, something that seemed to have no solution. But this vision reveals that God can still act, even when everything seems over. Because the impossible is not a limit for God, it is only a scenario where He manifests His power more clearly. When God's Spirit comes into action, what seemed definitive begins to change. Few people will understand this message deeply, but if you're here right now, there's a reason. Open your heart and continue until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can bring a new life to exactly what you thought you no longer had hope. And after realizing that God can bring life to what seemed dead, another inevitable reality emerges. Storms. Because even with faith, even with purpose, even with direction, there are times when everything starts to shake around. The disciples were exactly at that point. They were not far from Jesus. They were not out of the will. They were not lost. They were in the boat with Him. And yet the storm came. The wind began to blow strongly. The waves rose. The water began to invade the boat. The scenario was real, threatening, uncontrollable. And the most intriguing thing is that while all this was happening, Jesus was asleep. This creates a tension that is difficult to understand. How can there be so much chaos on one side and, at the same time, so much tranquility on the other? And perhaps this is one of the most challenging experiences of faith, when a person knows that God is present, but circumstances seem to say otherwise. When everything around is screaming danger, urgency, fear, and at the same time, it seems that the sky is silent. The disciples, overcome with fear, wake Jesus up with a question full of despair. They weren't just afraid of the storm, they were questioning whether he cared, and then something happens that completely changes the scenario. In Mark 4:39 it is written, "And he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Be still, be still.'" There was no effort, there was no struggle, there was no negotiation, just one word. And immediately, what seemed uncontrollable submits. This reveals something powerful. God's presence doesn't stop the storm from starting, but it does guarantee that it won't have the final say. Because when he speaks, even chaos obeys. The wind does not resist, the sea does not argue. Everything aligns with the authority of his voice. And here is a point that completely transforms the way you face difficult moments. True peace does not come from the absence of problems, but from the presence of Christ in the midst of them. The boat was still the same, the sea was the same, but the atmosphere changed completely when he got up. And perhaps the most profound thing about this story is to understand that Jesus was already in the boat all along. He did not come later. He did not appear in the midst of the crisis. He was already there. This means that even when it appears that he is silent, it does not mean absence. It means that there is something that will still be revealed at the right time. Because when his voice is manifested, everything changes. Fear loses strength, insecurity decreases, and a peace begins to occupy the space that was previously dominated by despair. Not because the person understands everything, but because they know who is in control. And maybe there's a storm going on in your life right now. Something that seems too big, too intense, difficult to control. But this story reveals that it is not the force of the storm that defines the ending, it is the voice of God. And when that voice kicks in, even what seemed impossible to calm finds silence. And after going through storms and realizing that God's voice has the power to calm chaos, an even deeper revelation emerges, something that is not only linked to difficult moments, but to the way we live every day. Because there is a silent but powerful difference between doing things for God and being with God. Mary, Martha's sister, reveals exactly this in a simple but meaningful moment. While everything around her was in motion, tasks being done, responsibilities being fulfilled, expectations being met, Maria makes an unusual decision. She stops. She stands at the feet of Jesus. In an environment where doing seemed more important, she chooses to be. And this draws attention, because it breaks the logic that it is always necessary to produce, act, solve. In Luke 10:42, Jesus states, "Mary has chosen the good part, which will not be taken away from her." This reveals that there is a choice that goes beyond external activities. It is not a matter of despising responsibilities, but of understanding what is essential. Because it is possible to be busy with many things, and at the same time distant from what really transforms. Mary did not make a great speech, she did not accomplish something visible, but she did something profound. She put herself in a place of intimacy, and it is in this place that something begins to change from the inside out. Because true transformation is not born from the amount of things that someone does, but from the closeness that this person develops with God. And perhaps this is a point that many ignore. The presence of God is not accessed by religious effort, by attempts to impress, by accumulation of activities. It is experienced in the relationship, in the simplicity of being, of listening, of staying. It is a place where the heart slows down and begins to realize what really matters. And when someone chooses that place, something begins to happen quietly but profoundly. The way of thinking changes, decisions gain more clarity, emotions begin to align, not because everything around has changed, but because something inside has been adjusted. Intimacy with God generates continuous transformation. Martha was concerned about many things, but Jesus shows that only one was needed at that time. This reveals that not everything that seems urgent is essential, and often excessive occupation can take away from what most needs to be cultivated. Mary chose the good part, and that choice is still available. It doesn't depend on scenery, it doesn't depend on perfect weather, it doesn't depend on ideal conditions. It is a decision, an internal positioning of prioritizing what really transforms. And perhaps at this moment, this message is bringing a silent confirmation, an invitation to slow down, to get closer, to value presence more than performance. Because it is in this place that everything begins to make sense in a deeper way. If this is making sense to you right now as an answer you needed, write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." Sometimes, acknowledging this in words is the first step to living this truth more intensely every day. And after understanding that intimacy with God transforms the interior, an even more challenging level of this journey arises, because it is not just about hearing, feeling, or perceiving, but about acting when there are no guarantees. Joshua is exactly at this point. In front of it is the Jordan River, not at an ordinary time, but in the flood season, when its waters overflow and make the crossing humanly impossible. There were no bridges, there were no alternative strategies, there was no plan B. There was only one direction, and this direction made no logical sense. God did not say to wait for the water level to drop. He did not suggest getting around the problem. He did not offer a visible solution in advance. On the contrary, in Joshua 3:13 it is written, "And it shall come to pass that when the soles of the feet of the priests, if they stand in the waters of the Jordan, the waters will part." This reveals something that directly confronts the human way of acting. The miracle would not come before the movement, it would come after. This completely changes the perspective. Because the natural tendency is to want to see first and then to trust, to want security before moving forward, to want guarantees before obeying. But God's presence in this case manifests itself in a different way. The path does not open to convince, it opens to confirm. The priests had to take the first step with the river still closed. They had to step on the water without seeing any immediate change, and it is exactly at this point that obedience becomes radical, not based on what is seen, but on what has been said, not supported by visible evidence, but by trust in God's voice. And when his feet touched the waters, something began to happen. The impossible began to move. What seemed insurmountable began to open up. Not before, but at the moment of obedience. This reveals a profound principle. There are paths that only reveal themselves when someone decides to move forward, even without seeing everything. And maybe that's speaking directly to something that you're facing right now. A decision that needs to be made, a step that needs to be taken, something that seems too uncertain to trust. But this story shows that God's presence is not limited to explaining the way. It manifests itself as the path is traveled. Obedience activates dimensions that cannot be seen in advance. It opens doors that were closed, reveals directions that were hidden, transforms barriers into passages. Not because everything was clear beforehand, but because someone decided to trust enough to act. Joshua didn't just listen, he responded. And this answer opened a path where before there was only impossibility. This shows that faith is not passive, it moves. And when it moves, something begins to line up in a supernatural way. And there is a level of God's presence that is only experienced by those who choose to obey even without guarantees. Because it is in this place that the invisible begins to become visible, and what seemed impossible begins to reveal a new path. And when one begins to experience this level of obedience, a silent danger arises that can compromise the entire journey: pride. Because as results appear, doors open, and achievements begin to become visible, there is a subtle tendency to shift focus. What was once dependence can turn into self-sufficiency without the person realizing it. Uzziah lives exactly this process. He started well, sought God, was directed, prospered, grew, strengthened. But at a certain point, something changed inside him. Success began to occupy a space that should remain with God. The trust that was previously in the divine presence began to be supported by his own achievements. And that's exactly where the path starts to deviate. Because the problem was never the growth, it was the change in the position of the heart. Uzziah stopped depending to start trusting himself. And this reveals something profound. It is not only the beginning that matters, but the way in which one remains. In James 4:6 it is written, "God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." This statement is not symbolic. It reveals a direct spiritual principle. Where there is pride, there is resistance. Where there is humility, there is access. This means that God's presence is not fully manifested where one believes that one no longer needs him. And here's a point that transforms everything. Humility is not weakness. It is not diminishing oneself. It is not denying capabilities. Humility is recognizing the origin of everything. It is to understand that what you have, what you conquer, what you live, is not born only from human effort, but from the presence of God who sustains every detail. When one lives with this awareness, something changes completely. There is a lightness, a healthy dependence, a constant connection. The person does not rely only on what he knows, what he can or what he has already achieved, but remains sensitive, open, dependent. And this opens spiritual doors that pride closes. Because pride pushes away, hardens, isolates. Humility, on the other hand, brings you closer, connects, and keeps your heart aligned. The presence of God becomes more perceptible, more active, more constant in the life of those who recognize that they need Him at all times. And perhaps this is an essential point in this journey, because it is not enough to start well. It is necessary to remain well positioned. It is not enough to experience the presence of God in some moments. It is necessary to live with this dependence every day. Those who understand this experience something different. Not only external results, but a real closeness, an intimacy that sustains, directs, and transforms continuously. Because in the end, it's not about how much someone has achieved, but about how much they have remained dependent on God every step of the way. And when this humility begins to align the heart, something even more powerful manifests, something that many consider simple, but that carries a spiritual depth that few truly access. Gratitude. Not as an automatic gesture, not as a superficial response, but as a key that unlocks deeper dimensions of God's presence. The story of the 10 lepers reveals just that. Everyone was in the same condition, everyone cried out, everyone received healing, but only one returned. This seems like a detail, but it actually reveals a huge spiritual difference. 10 received the miracle, but only one recognized the origin. And this recognition made all the difference. In Luke 17:19, Jesus declares, "Arise and go, your faith has made you well." This shows that there was something beyond physical healing. Something deeper happened to the one who returned. Because gratitude is not just a reaction to what has been received, it is a connection with the one who has delivered. The others went about their lives with the blessing in their hands, but without returning to the source. And this reveals something that many do not realize. Ingratitude not only ignores what has been done, it limits what could still be lived. The one who came back was not only healed, he was transformed in a more complete way. He accessed a deeper level of God's presence. This shows that gratitude expands spiritual awareness. It makes the person not only receive, but recognize, value, and stay connected. And perhaps this is an essential point in this journey, because many times the person prays, asks, seeks, receives, but quickly goes on and on to recognize, and with that, you lose the opportunity to experience something bigger. Not because God failed to act, but because the connection was not cultivated. Gratitude keeps the heart sensitive. It prevents routine from turning the extraordinary into something ordinary. It preserves the awareness that everything comes from God. And when this awareness is kept alive, His presence becomes more evident, more constant, more profound. And it doesn't depend on big things. Sometimes it starts with small recognitions, short breaks, small moments of awareness, but they are building something bigger inside, a real connection, a closeness that transforms. Because when someone lives with gratitude, they start to see differently. What previously went unnoticed gains meaning. What seemed ordinary reveals purpose. And the presence of God ceases to be something distant, to become something lived in every detail. In the next few minutes, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can completely change how you perceive what you are experiencing right now. Keep going, because this might be just the sign you needed to understand. And after understanding that gratitude keeps the connection alive, one of the most challenging moments of the spiritual journey arises, the one in which it seems that God is silent. It's not a lack of faith, it's not an absence of searching, it's not disinterest. On the contrary, it is exactly when someone prays, cries out, hopes, and does not receive immediate responses. Habakkuk lives this scenario intensely. He questions, he observes what is happening around him, he does not understand the ways, and above all, he expects an answer that does not seem to arrive. And that silence can be uncomfortable, because the mind begins to try to fill in the spaces, the heart begins to restless, and the question arises, is God listening? But it is precisely here that one of the deepest secrets of the divine presence is revealed. God's silence does not mean absence, it means process. In Habakkuk 2:3 it is written, "For the vision is yet to be fulfilled at the appointed time. If it delays, wait for it." This shows that there is a time that is not controlled by human anxiety. There is a movement happening, even if it is not visible. And that requires something that goes beyond the initial faith. It requires perseverance, because it is easy to believe when everything is clear, when the answers are quick, when the signs are evident. But mature faith develops precisely in silence. It is in this space that the heart is aligned, that trust is deepened, that dependence becomes more real. God is not standing still. He is working invisibly. And perhaps this is one of the most difficult points to accept, because the human being wants to see, wants to understand, wants to anticipate. But God often chooses to act behind the scenes, preparing, adjusting, aligning details that will only make sense later. And in the meantime, the invitation is to stay. Habakkuk did not receive all the answers immediately, but he was given one direction: wait. Not as someone who is standing still meaninglessly, but as someone who trusts that something is being built. This completely changes the way of looking at silence. It ceases to be a void and becomes a space for preparation. And those who remain steadfast in that time begin to perceive something different, a strength that does not come from circumstances, a peace that does not depend on quick answers, a confidence that is sustained even without seeing. Because deep down, something has already been established. God is still present. And maybe you're right there, right now. Praying, waiting, trying to understand but without clear answers. But this word brings a truth that needs to be kept. God did not stop acting. Silence is not rejection, it is preparation. There is something being formed, something being aligned, something being prepared at the right time. And when that time comes, what seemed to take time will make sense in a way that today is not yet possible to see. Meanwhile, God's presence continues to sustain, guide, and strengthen each step, even if silently. And it is precisely in this place of perseverance, where many think that everything is at a standstill, that a new dimension of God's presence begins to be revealed. Because it's not just about being sustained, comforted, or guided, but about being empowered. There is a moment when faith ceases to be just resistance and becomes authority. The disciples experienced this directly. They didn't just walk with Jesus, they were sent, put into action, and when they returned, they were impressed with what they had experienced. They realized that something had changed. They were no longer just followers. They were active instruments of an authority that did not come from them. In Luke 10:19, Jesus declares, "Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions and all the strength of the enemy." This statement reveals a truth that many have not yet fully understood. God's presence not only protects, it empowers to cope. This means that the spiritual walk is not passive. It's not just about enduring hardships, but also about standing up for them. There is a dimension where the spiritual world responds to those who carry the presence of God, not by his own merit, not by human force, but by an authority that is delegated. And here is an essential point. This authority is not independent, it is directly linked to alignment with Christ. The more someone lives connected, the more this authority becomes evident, not as something exhibited, but as something lived. It is an inner security, a spiritual firmness, an awareness that you are not fighting alone. The disciples were not prepared by human standards to face unseen forces, but they were connected with those who had all authority. And that made all the difference. Because in the spiritual world, it is not the size of the person that defines the outcome, it is the presence he carries. And maybe this will completely change the way you have faced certain situations. Because there are battles that are not only external, they are spiritual. Thoughts, oppressions, fears, influences that cannot be resolved with logic or human effort alone. And it is exactly there that this authority manifests itself. When someone understands that they carry the presence of God, they stop reacting only as someone ordinary and begin to position themselves with a different conviction, not based on feelings, but on spiritual truth. And that changes the environment, changes the atmosphere, changes the way things unfold, because God's presence not only accompanies, it activates. It strengthens, it directs, it establishes authority over that which once seemed uncontrollable. And when this awareness becomes real, the journey gains new strength. It is no longer just about enduring what comes, but about understanding that there is power available to face, resist, and move forward. An authority that does not come from within the human being, but from a living connection with God, which completely transforms the way of living and reacting to everything that once seemed greater. And when this spiritual authority begins to manifest itself, something even deeper comes into play, because it is not just about winning battles or taking a stand, but about how the heart presents itself before God. Generosity reveals exactly that. Not as an outward act, but as an inward expression of trust. The scene is simple, almost unnoticed by many, people contributing, offering, delivering what they have. But in the midst of all this, a widow approaches. No prominence, no appearance of importance, no significant resources. She deposits 2 small coins, something that to human eyes seemed irrelevant, almost worthless. But something happens at this moment that completely changes the way you see the situation. Jesus observes. And not only observes, he highlights. In Mark 12:43, he declares, "This poor widow gave more than all." This completely breaks the common logic, because it's not about the quantity, it's about the delivery. While many gave of what was left, she gave of what she had. While others contributed without feeling impacted, she delivered something that made a real difference in her own life. And this reveals a powerful spiritual principle. God does not measure by external value. He looks at the heart behind the action. True generosity is born in this place, not as an obligation, not as an appearance, but as trust. Trust that God remains the source, even when something is released. Trust that what is delivered does not diminish, but makes room for something greater. And this is not limited to money. It is linked to everything that someone offers: time, attention, care, willingness. And perhaps this is a point that few realize. The presence of God is manifested in an intense way where there is sincere surrender. Because generosity breaks the logic of scarcity. It declares, even without words, that there is a greater source sustaining everything. And this activates something in the spiritual world. The widow didn't have much, but she had faith. And that faith was expressed in the way she delivered. It wasn't the value that drew attention, it was the confidence. And this reveals that a little, when given in faith, becomes great before God. And when someone starts living that way, something changes. The mentality transforms, the fear of missing decreases, confidence grows, because the person stops clinging only to what he sees and begins to live based on what he believes. And that opens up a different flow. It's no longer about retaining, it's about trusting. It's no longer about hoarding, it's about recognizing that everything comes from God, and everything can be placed in His hands. And when this happens, the divine presence becomes even more evident, because there is room for Him to act. And perhaps, in this moment, there is something within you being awakened. A realization that it's not just about what you have, but how you deliver. Because generosity does not diminish, it multiplies in ways that go beyond what can be calculated. At the end of this video, something even deeper will be released, something that can make you feel God's presence in a way you may never have experienced. Stay, because this moment can mark a real turning point in your spiritual life. And after understanding that sincere surrender moves the heart of God, an even more delicate moment of the spiritual journey arises, the one in which everything is at stake, but not everyone realizes it. The setting is Gethsemane, a place of decision, of tension, of spiritual depth. Jesus knew what was coming. He felt the weight of that moment. It wasn't just another night, it was a turning point. And yet, as he looks around, he finds his disciples sleeping. This reveals something that continues to happen today. Decisive spiritual moments often go unnoticed due to lack of vigilance. Not because God is not present, but because attention is not aligned. At Matthew 26:41, Jesus says, "Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation." This instruction is not just advice, it is a key to protection and direction. Because there are times when it is not the strength that will sustain, it is the sensitivity. It is the ability to perceive what is happening beyond what is visible. The disciples were physically close to Jesus, but spiritually disconnected at that moment. Sleep represents more than tiredness. It represents distraction, lack of perception, absence of alertness. And this can happen in a very subtle way. Routine, worries, thoughts, all of this can take up space until the heart is no longer attentive. And when this happens, important decisions can be made without clarity, paths can be followed without discernment, spiritual opportunities can be lost without realizing it. Spiritual vigilance is not living in tension, but living in consciousness. It is keeping the heart awake, sensitive, attentive to what God is doing, because when someone watches, they begin to perceive signs, directions, alerts. He begins to understand time, to recognize moments, to position himself more firmly. And perhaps this is one of the most important points of this journey, because it is not enough just to believe. It is necessary to remain attentive. It is not enough to start well. It is necessary to remain vigilant. There are phases in which everything seems peaceful, but that's exactly where distraction can come in. Jesus did not ask for something impossible. He showed a way. Watch and pray. This keeps the heart aligned, protects against hasty decisions, strengthens against temptations that often come silently. The one who watches is not taken by surprise because he is connected. And perhaps this moment is more important than it seems. Maybe there's something going on around you, something being prepared, something being defined, and that demands attention, not only to the natural eyes, but to the spiritual eyes, because those who watch walk clearly, even in the midst of shadows. They do not depend only on what they see, but on what they discern, and that makes all the difference. And if that word has awakened something within you, as a warning, as a confirmation, perhaps it is time to respond in a simple but true way. Write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Sometimes such a statement is the beginning of a new level of vigilance and connection to what God is doing now. What we have just realized so far reveals something profound. It is not enough just to understand. It is necessary to respond. Each teaching, each sign, each moment of spiritual awakening pointed to the same direction, the need to approach God in a real, living, and intentional way. The vigilance that keeps the heart attentive also prepares the spirit for this encounter, because those who are awake recognize the moment to surrender, to stop everything and simply seek. In Jeremiah 29:13, it is written, "And ye shall seek me and find me when ye search for me with all your heart." This promise leaves no room for doubt. God is not far away, he is available. It is not a meeting reserved for a few, but for all those who decide to open their hearts with sincerity. And this is exactly what transforms everything, because it is no longer a matter of hearing about him, but of talking to him. Now that moment becomes personal. All that has been reflected so far finds meaning when it is brought into the presence of God, not as repeated words, but as a true dialogue. It is the time to deliver thoughts, concerns, fears, and also what has not even been said out loud, but which is already in the heart. So, this is the moment. Let's pray together, with sincerity, with faith, trusting that God is present now, listening to every word and touching deeply every area of your life. Beloved Father, your word assures us that you are close to all those who call upon you in truth, and it is with this certainty that we now place ourselves before your presence, recognizing that this is not just an ordinary moment, but a real encounter with you, where heaven touches earth and the invisible begins to manifest itself. Lord, we thank you for every word released so far, for every teaching that has reached the heart, for every revelation that has brought light where there was doubt before. Thank you that you have never been far away, even when we didn't realize it, and that your presence has sustained us every step of the way. Now, Father, we ask you for strength and wisdom. It enables each person who is in prayer at this moment to live all that has been revealed, to walk in faith even without seeing, to obey even without fully understanding, to remain firm even in times of silence. Give discernment to recognize your voice, sensitivity to perceive your signs, and courage to move forward when you call. Let no fear, doubt, or insecurity be greater than the certainty of your presence. Lord, visit every need now. Where there is disease, it releases healing. Where there is oppression, it brings liberation. Where there is confusion, it establishes clarity. It touches families in need of restoration, homes in need of peace, lives facing financial, emotional, or spiritual difficulties. It opens doors where there is no path, brings provision where there is scarcity, renews strength where there is weariness. May all anxiety be replaced by a deep peace, the one that only the Lord can give. At this moment, in silence, each heart presents before you that which no one else sees, that which is kept, that which needs a touch of yours. Receive, Father, every request, every tear, every sincere cry that rises now as a living prayer before your throne. We commend everything into your hands, Lord. Our dreams, our fears, our plans, our uncertainties. We trust that your plan is perfect, that your timing is right, and that your will always be better than any path we could choose. Teach us to rest in you, to trust even when we don't understand, to stand firm, knowing that you are in control of all things. May your presence continue to be alive and constant after this prayer, guiding every step, illuminating every decision, and strengthening every heart. As it is written, let thy peace, which passeth all understanding, guard our minds and hearts in Christ Jesus. We declare that we are not alone, that the Lord is with us, today and always. In Jesus' name, amen. And if that prayer expresses what is in your heart, write Amen as an act of faith and agreement with all that has been stated here. Throughout everything we have experienced here, one truth has become impossible to ignore. God has never been far away. In every silent pain, in every hidden doubt, in every moment of weakness, His presence has always been there, sustaining, guiding, and calling you closer. This message is for you, not by chance, but because God has chosen you to hear it today. I am with you is not just a beautiful phrase, it is a living reality that completely transforms the way you face life. When you understand this, fear loses strength, anxiety decreases, and walking takes on a new meaning. Now the question that remains is simple but profound. Will you continue to live as if you were alone, or will you begin to walk aware that God is with you at every step? And let me tell you something from the heart. It's a great joy to have you here until this moment. This shows that there is something inside you, looking for more, wanting to grow, wanting to connect with God in a real way. And you are part of it. You are part of this journey. Therefore, I want to invite you to take a simple but important step. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any message like this. And more than that, I want to get to know you better. Comment below where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of your story of what you are experiencing. We are here to walk together, and your life matters, your story matters, and it can touch other people too. And it doesn't stop here, because this is just the beginning. In the next video, we'll dive even deeper into how to live out God's presence daily, how to recognize God's signs in practical ways, and how to strengthen your faith even in difficult times. There's a next level to that journey, and it's closer than you might think. Don't ignore it, because it might be just what you need right now. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.